Well, thank you, everybody, and welcome to this Veritas Forum at Harvard Medical School. I am so looking forward to learning from Professor Brooks over this next hour with all of you about happiness. Happiness, as I don't need to remind all of you, is so important to our community. We have physicians, we have public health professionals, we have biomedical scientists, and we have students who are on their educational journey toward entering these different careers. And I think we all know that our collective profession is in a little bit of a crisis right now. Kristen alluded to this, right? Practicing doctors are reporting burnout at high rates, and those rates are increasing more so than in other professions. Our medical students, graduate students, dental students are reporting poor mental health at high rates. And if you look at doctors out in clinical practice, the frequency with which they say that they might be changing jobs or maybe even leaving clinical medicine entirely is high and is rising, and that's not something that's happening in other professions. So there's multiple factors that contribute to these dispiriting observations, and there's not going to be one simple answer to them. But I will say that if you're somebody who, after years and years of education and training to get to where you are thinking about leaving your job or changing your circumstances, in some ways you're telling us that you are not, in essence, fully happy. Now, within our Harvard Medical School community, there's something beyond just our own happiness, our own personal well-being, not that that's not important, but we also have our societal obligations and our societal responsibilities. So I noticed that the flyers around campus that were advertising this session said, happier doctor, healthier patient, ? I think we can pretty confidently replace that question mark with an exclamation point. Yes, when we are well, when we are happier, we are better able to take care of our patients the way that they deserve to be taken care of, right? Now, we happen to be in a profession in which even when we're not doing so well, we still have to do the best we can in clinical care. Sometimes that's not a very popular thing to say, but it's true. But for sure, when we are happier and when we are well, we are able to give our best selves to the care of our patients and to advancing medical science and the kinds of discoveries that are important for human health in the future. I'll just conclude my remarks with a little personal reflection here. I've been in this position for about 6 months. So a little bit more than a year ago, I was applying for this job. And every once in a while, I look back at the letter of intent that I wrote with my application just to remind myself what I said I was going to be doing if I got this job. And what I said was that I wanted the program in medical education here at HMS to be productive, cohesive, and happy. Now, I didn't know I was going to be in this role. I didn't know we were going to have a Veritas Forum. I didn't know I was going to be sitting across from Arthur Brooks. But for me to achieve those goals, particularly that last one, we need to learn. We need to understand what happiness is. So thank you for joining us today. And thank you, Professor Brooks, for coming.
Thank you, Bernard. Thank you very much, and appreciate having all of you here today for this conversation. I do work a lot with corporate leaders and people in all different walks of life who are they're looked to as bastions of solutions to the problems in our society. And there's nobody that fits that bill more than doctors. But I look after the happiness of the leaders themselves. And looking behind the curtain, there's a very different reality that I find than one which the public actually expects. The notion that you have high social esteem, high incomes, automatically you must be the happiest people in our society if you're doctors. And it's not true. The truth of the matter is that I find loneliness levels among doctors to be higher than in any other single profession. I find people that are facing levels of social isolation and exhaustion that patients don't understand, that public policy makers don't understand, that often your families don't understand either. That's why I've specialized in not just the happiness of anybody in our society, but of the people who probably need it the most, the people who need to put on their own oxygen mask first, as they say on the airlines. And that's you. If I could do my job doing that tonight, and if I'm successful at it, I can give you a few tips of what the science says about how you can live better, happier lives, and as such, you can pass that on as leaders to the people that are under your care. Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, thanks so much for that. As scientists, as clinicians, If you give us a variable, if you give us a parameter, if you give us a metric, we need to define it first. So when we talk about happiness, what do you mean by happiness? What is this anyway?
Yeah, and so this is the question that my students have on the first day of class. I teach 2 sections of 90 MBA students that are over at HBS. I have 400 students on the waiting list. There's an illegal Zoom link they think I don't know about. What's up with that? The answer is there's a great need. And happiness is something that everybody wants, and you know when you don't have it, but you don't quite know what it is. So that's the first order of business, to talk about what it is. I ask my students to define it, and they'll say, it's the feeling I get when I'm with the people that I love. Or it's how I feel when I'm doing the things that I enjoy. And I say, that's a very plausible definition, and it's wrong, because happiness is not a feeling, any more than the smell of your turkey is not your Thanksgiving dinner. The smell of the turkey is evidence of the Thanksgiving dinner, and the emotions associated with happiness are evidence of happiness, and that's incredibly good news. If happiness were a feeling, it would be fleeting. All of you know something that most people who are not in the medical sciences don't understand, which is that emotions, both positive and negative, are incredibly important. There is no such thing as bad feelings. Negative emotions are critically important for you to ascertain and react appropriately to threat, such that if you wanted to be happy and that depended on never having negative emotions, good luck to you. You should not try to eradicate your negative emotions. You should try to manage them. And you need a better definition of happiness going in. Happiness, according to the best literature that we have today in modern social sciences, is a combination of 3 phenomena. Now, this is based on measurements of life satisfaction from people who report reliably the highest levels of life satisfaction. There are 3 phenomena that they have in conjunction, both in abundance and balance. Now, this is kind of like the macronutrients of happiness. Or if I said, what is your Thanksgiving dinner? You know, your doctors, you'd say protein, carbohydrates, and fat. It's not a very romantic way to think of Thanksgiving. Nonetheless, it's true. Your happiness is similar. It's a combination of enjoyment, satisfaction, and meaning. Those are the 3 things that you need, whether you're a college professor or a medical doctor or a politician or putting roofs on houses. We all need this in all our different walks of life. Enjoyment sounds straightforward, but it isn't. It's not the same thing, for example, as pleasure. Pleasure is a sort of a limbic phenomenon. It's a signal that something is going to give you calories or mating choices or something. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, that the old hippie dictum that if it feels good, do it, is the best life advice for ruining your life. It's a terrible life strategy because all you're doing is you're living in an entirely limbic way. Enjoyment is something that's more fully human. It moves the experience of pleasure into the prefrontal cortex of your brain where you can understand it and remember it. You think about sources of pleasure, adding people and memory. That's what turns it into enjoyment, at least the way that we like to define it. And enjoyment is an authentic source of happiness. Think of it this way. The Anheuser-Busch Corporation never does an ad of a guy alone in his apartment pounding a 12-pack. There's a reason for that. That's the pursuit of pleasure. And that's not what you want to advertise as a beer company. In the beer commercial, the guy is opening a Budweiser with his brother and friends. Why? Because the source of pleasure adds people and memory becomes enjoyment, and that associates the brand with happiness. The general advice that I give to young people today that I teach is that if something gives you pleasure and it can be addictive, never do it alone. That's the general rule. Now that's not on tablets from Mount Sinai, but you get the point that I'm trying to make. Obviously there's a lot of biology that goes into it, and that's enjoyment, and that's pillar 1. The second is satisfaction. Satisfaction is the joy that we get after struggle, which is the weirdest human thing. My dog doesn't like to have struggle to get more joy from things. You know, my dog would lie down and eat out of the plate if he could, right? We want to struggle. We get more satisfaction. We get more joy from accomplishments after we struggle. We're made to struggle. I don't have to tell all of you, medical school, that's a struggle, right? But it's sweet when you get to the end of it as a result of that. And that's a really wonderful and it's an incredible phenomenon, as a matter of fact. That's why deferring your gratification is so critically important. That's one of the reasons you tell your kids not to snack before dinner, because not just because it's bad for their health, but because you want them to actually enjoy their dinner. My father-in-law, now of blessed memory, he lived through the Civil War in Spain. And all of his cultural references were to the Civil War. You know, every time you'd say something, you'd say, that reminds me of the Civil War. I mean, it was always the same thing. He was in a refugee camp for a long time, and he had a lot of hunger. And he used to say, you know, the Civil War taught me something about why people aren't very happy today. Well, tell me more, because this is my gig. What is it about the Civil War that teaches you about happiness? He says, the problem is people aren't happy today because they don't enjoy their dinner. And I said, huh? Why don't they enjoy their dinner? And he says, because they're never hungry. That's a comment on the human condition that's incredibly important and insightful that we need to understand and we need to practice. But there's a little tyrannical twist behind this as well, which is that satisfaction is something that we seek because it's so sweet, but it never lasts. You know, Mick Jagger saying, I can't get no satisfaction, but I try and I try and I try. He's wrong. You can get it. The problem is you can't keep no satisfaction. And that's because of a phenomenon you're all very familiar with in all biological processes called homeostasis, the return to equilibrium. The body is homeostatic because you have to be back to being ready for the next set of circumstances. You get off the treadmill, your pulse goes back to its base rate so you don't die in a week. The same thing is true for you emotionally, but we never know that for the things that we're trying to do to get satisfaction. We don't know that we're going to homeostasis is going to take us back to our emotional baseline, and we're not going to enjoy things for very long. And so we try and we try and we try and we try. And I talk an awful lot, and we can if you want, about how to maintain a high level of satisfaction, but it requires standing up to Mother Nature, quite frankly. The last and most complicated component of happiness is meaning. And this is a really tricky one for everybody, doctors included. Meaning is basically a combination of three phenomena: significance, coherence, and purpose. Significance is my life has a meaning to it. It has a reason for its existence. Purpose is my life has direction. And coherence is things happen for a reason. People with a spiritual religious bent, they naturally have answers to these questions. But even if you're not a very religious person, you can find answers to these questions. I recommend to all of my students that they kind of go on a quest to boil this down to two questions you need to answer. Why am I alive? And for what would I be willing to die today? If you don't have answers to those questions, you kind of axiomatically have a meaning crisis. and that's a problem, obviously, but it's a huge opportunity because now you know that the questions to go in search of the answer to. A lot of people looking for the answers to those questions, they will find their spiritual home. They will find a kind of a transcendent meaning. Why am I alive? Who created me and for what? For what would I be willing to give my life on this very day? They're impactful, they're empowering types of questions. And when you see somebody that you love find the answers to these questions, it can be really a miraculous thing. These are the three things to be looking for. And I give you kind of a little nuggets of how I do research and think about these things. But enjoyment, satisfaction, and meaning are the macronutrients of a happy life.
Wow. So, Professor Brooks, I'm a neurologist.
Yeah.
I know there are lots of examples in which we are not the best observers of our own condition. There's lots of examples in which our brain basically tricks us, for lack of a better term. And I remember learning that we are not very good predictors of our own happiness. Like, oh, if something were to happen to me, I bet I'd be this happy. Right. And I think we're not very good rememberers of past happiness as well. Is that right? Is that not what you mean by happiness? Am I talking about that feeling, that fleeting feeling?
Yeah, no, this is absolutely true, that we're incredibly unreliable. And there are a number of different reasons for this. My colleague Dan Gilbert wrote a book, a very famous book called Stumbling Upon Happiness. That's all about the mistakes that people make. And it's one of the most interesting things about this field is the mistakes that we make again and again and again. Now, part of the reason is that we have inaccurate information and we're bad observers of ourselves, to be sure. But part of the reason that we make mistakes is because Mother Nature wants us to make mistakes. This is something critically important for us to understand. Mother Nature's imperatives for human beings is survival and gene propagation. Mother Nature does not care if you're happy. Happiness is not a fitness measure that will help you to pass on your genes or to survive. Quite the contrary in many cases. So one of the things that's important for us to understand that this big prefrontal cortex, 30% by weight of the human brain. I'm on your territory now, so I say this with appropriate humility. I haven't weighed my own brain. But this is extraordinary. There aren't any other species with this much space dedicated to it, the C-suite of the brain. The important thing for us to understand is that we don't have to rely on our limbic tendencies, what Mother Nature's imperatives are for us. We can have deeply human decisions that stand up to our urges. This is what, religious people, what Christian people like me, we call the divine path versus the animal path. Your choice. And even if you're not religious, you realize that there's there's sort of the lizard path and the human path. A lot of what I wind up talking about with scientists and medical professionals is the management of our own emotions. Standing up to the fact that, and I'll give you an example of this. I talked about how satisfaction is so fleeting and we keep getting fooled by it. It's like if I get that watch, I'm going to love it forever. If I have that relationship, I'll be happy forever. If I have that car, the new smell will persist. No, it won't. It won't. But you get fooled again and again and again. Why? Because you seek that joy that comes from satisfaction. And Mother Nature wants you to think it's going to persist, so you'll stay in the hunt. That's been passed down through evolutionary fitness, generation after generation, but it's your Pleistocene brain. Here's the problem. Satisfaction is not a function of you having more and more and more and more and more. Satisfaction is better modeled by all the things you have divided by the things that you want. The divine path is not one of managing the numerator of your satisfaction equation. It's one of managing the denominator of your satisfaction equation. Mother Nature doesn't want you to do that, but you can. You can actually become more permanently satisfied with your life, not by having more, but by wanting less. And that requires courage and power over yourself and incredible self-management. But it also requires the information and the incredible new information that's actually coming from this field.
Yeah. So you have written about unhappiness, right, negative emotions, trying to be better at managing one's emotions. Right. So this is a skill that we can develop then. Are we all starting out with different baseline levels of happiness or different baseline abilities to manage our own emotions?
So emotions and happiness are slightly different subjects. And the reason is because the way we talk about happiness is in subjective well-being, which is a much broader context for the way that emotions play into our lives and the events and the way that we see our lives. So if I ask you, how happy are you, taking all things in consideration over this 2-year period, comparing yourself to everybody you know, you're going to give me a very different evaluation than Bernard, how do you feel right now? Very different kind of thing. The science of emotion, however, is critically important for us to understand the management of our happiness. Now, most emotion researchers these days, we're understanding more and more the neuroscience of how emotions are produced by getting a better map of the limbic system and the different components and how they work in conjunction with each other. It's a tendency to be very reductive about this, and then we talk to neuroscientists and neurologists who say, I'm sorry, there's a lot more to it than all this. But the best understanding that occurs right now is that basic emotions are common to everybody. We basically have the same kitchen, but we all make different meals. The kitchen is stocked with the same ingredients. And so, most emotion researchers say that there's somewhere between 6 and 10 basic emotions. They kind of all agree on the negative emotions. The negative emotions are fear, anger, disgust, and sadness. And they all have different evolutionary reasons for existence, and they're all critically important. The amygdala is largely governing fear and anger. The insular cortex is largely governing the disgust function in our brain that keeps us alive and alert to pathogens. Sadness, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and other, mental pain parts of the limbic system are responsible for making us feel grief and feeling a sense of being bereft when we're separated from our loved ones and our kin, such that 500,000 years ago we wouldn't be separated from our loved ones and walk the frozen tundra and die alone. There's evolutionary reasons for all this, but nonetheless we feel them very intensely. The positive emotions, the positive basic emotions are certainly joy. Most researchers say interest is a positive basic emotion. If you like what we're talking about here, beyond the practical implications, though, you just find it interesting, that gives you a sense of pleasure because we're evolved to learn. We're a learning species. Most emotion researchers say surprise is a basic emotion that's kind of a neutral emotion, can be good or bad, right? All humor is based on surprise, for example, but most CEOs say, don't surprise me, right? Because it's negative and positive events, which are evolved to get your attention. If there's a gunshot that goes off in here, we're all going to be surprised by that because that'll get our attention and change the equilibrium that we're in. Okay, the reason I say that is because those 7 are pretty much agreed upon, but then the intensity of different people's different emotions in different contexts, that's how we're all different. That's a really interesting thing, and I do a lot of work on the emotional profile that people have with their differing intensity levels across negative and positive. Most emotion researchers believe that there's kind of, again, this reduces things a little bit, but it's illustrative of what we understand today. There's 4 kinds of people emotionally that use the same emotions in different ways. You have people who have unusually high positive affect. They feel intensely their positive emotions, and unusually high negative affect. They feel intensely their negative emotions. These are people called the mad scientists. That's most of you, right? I mean, that's gonna be most of you, because literally some of you are mad scientists. I mean, and that's, everything is good or bad, or good and bad, and you're impossible to be married to, right? But you're intensely interesting and engaged. There are people who are very intensely positive and weakly negative. These are the cheerleaders, right? These are the people that people want to be around all the time. They have the highest subjective well-being scores. They often make really bad leaders. The reason is because they can't stand bad news. They won't take negative, anything, and they won't give negative evaluations to anybody. So if you have somebody who's a professor or somebody, is that they want to give everybody an A all the time, which is unhelpful. Actually, if 2 cheerleaders who won't deal with bad news fall in love and get married, they always go bankrupt because they take out 13 credit cards and think nothing could go wrong, right? Okay. There are people who are low affect people who, they're not unhappy or happy, but they experience low levels of positive and negative affect. Now we know that, and we can actually see this in the way that we're looking at, we're actually looking at the brain. So the kinds of things that we do, we just have low levels of intensity of emotional stimuli. These are people we call judges, but we might as well call them surgeons. You know, why? Because when somebody cuts me open, I don't want them to say, oh my God, that's not what I'm looking for. I want somebody to go, okay, I can take that out. Right? I want somebody as cool as a cucumber. And then you have people who are high negative and low positive. These are the poets. And these are the most interesting cases. People have high negative emotional intensity and low positive emotional intensity. These poets are really interesting because they display high levels of creativity, high levels of ruminative activity. They tend to be depressed. And the new research that we're looking at is so interesting. I'm on your turf now, so forgive me here, but it's high levels of activity of the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. Literally, physiologically bigger ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, and in that it's so associated with rumination. They tend to get infatuated with other people, which is a form of rumination when you're falling in love. They tend to be incredibly creative because you ruminate on a business plan or a symphony or a poem, and they tend to be depressives because they ruminate on sources of regret and problems that they're having. These are the poets. Anatomically, their brains are the most interesting of all. So this is the stuff that we're looking at. We can understand ourselves better, complement our relationships, surround ourselves with people who complement us, know ourselves, manage ourselves, love ourselves, and sometimes ask for help.
Well, as folks are, I'm sure, self-diagnosing and diagnosing their family members right now, I want to ask you about some of the sources of happiness. You've talked about family, friends, you've written about work and faith.
Yeah.
Let's talk about work for a second. So I suspect that many people in the audience don't necessarily see work as a potential source of happiness. So in our community, if you're spending long hours in the hospital, long hours in the lab, you have a failed experiment, you get a rejected manuscript, you get a patient who has a bad outcome, how can work be the source of happiness for us?
Yeah. One of the things that we find for people who are deeply, deeply invested personally in their work, who work incredibly long hours, right? The same thing in my business students who become investment bankers, 110 hours a week. Insanity. Right, is that they can't distinguish their work from their careers. Your work is your life, and your life is your work, and there's no boundary because you're actually living this as just your routine is the way that this actually works out. And so that lack of a boundary means that it's not really meaningful to say that work should be a source of joy, because work is simply all good things and all bad things because it's all things. That's unhealthy. That leads to burnout. You actually need more boundaries. And we can talk about that because I know we're going to talk about burnout in due course. But one of the things that when we do research on the joy that comes from work, there's the mistakes that people make thinking they're going to get joy from work, and there's the things that really do bring joy from work. So let's start with the mistakes. Number one is thinking that the prestige that actually comes from your work or the money that's going to bring you happiness. It is not. It absolutely is not. As sure as we're sitting here, I will promise you that will wear off faster than the new car smell. We all want to be respected for what we do, and we all chase these earthly rewards of money and power and pleasure and honor. We all do these things, but those rewards lie to you. I say this as a social scientist. They will lie. They will call to you and say that these things, that doing a fancy thing for work and being respected by other people is going to be the best thing ever. It's going to be the source of your joy. It is not. It will lie to you, and you won't know why you feel hollow and empty inside. There are really only two things from work, and they're the same things that work for doctors and roofers and plumbers and everybody else. That's called earned success and serving other people. Those are the two sources of joy in work. And I say that based on volumes of data looking at different jobs and the people who get joy from their jobs. Now, earning your success means you're creating value and you're being rewarded and recognized and acknowledged for the value that you're creating with your work, with your life and in the lives of other people. Lots of doctors feel this, and it's really great. The second is serving other people. You're lightening the load for other people. You're making life better for other people. Lots of doctors feel that too. But it's funny, when I'm talking to doctors who are feeling pretty burnt out, the main reason they're starting to get away from those feelings. They're working for a big hospital system, a big, I know. Sorry, I don't mean to hit a nerve here, guys. A big bureaucratic hospital system that's not really thinking about patient outcomes the way that you should. It's kind of like you're a cog in a machine and they're numbers. And the result is that you don't feel like you're earning your success. And the patient care that you're giving is disconnected from the recognition and acknowledgement that you should be getting. And you're being given incentives that don't feel like they're helping to serve other people as much as you should. If you're burning out, probably the reason is because the incentives and the workflow in your career is pushing you away from a feeling of earned success and service to other people. And the way to solve that is to find some way to get back to those two pillars of joy at work. That's true for you, and it's true for people in business, and it's true for lawyers, and even lawyers can serve other people, it turns out.
But service to other people when they are sick,
right,
when they are in trouble, when they are in crisis, taking that load off.
Right.
That's not a source of burnout for us as clinicians.
It can be, and there are a number of different reasons that it can be as well. So one of the things that we find is that caregivers, when they're doing their work to the exclusion of their own well-being, then it can tip into burnout really, really quickly. It's not the case that serving other people as many hours as you possibly can to the exclusion of your health and welfare and your relationships and your love and yourself and your faith and your spirituality and your connection to the divine. All of it goes out the window if you can see 10 more patients. No. Like anything else, there's negative marginal returns that comes from this. Put on your own oxygen mask, or you're going to be suffocating and you're not going to be much good to anybody else.
Yeah. I want to ask you about faith.
Yeah.
We're not going to get into science, religion, all those issues. The Veritas forums have done that actually very well in a lot of different circumstances. What is the role of faith in personal happiness?
Yeah, it's very clear that when you look at the happiest people, they have kind of a portfolio of things that they pursue. The happiest people, I could give you 10,000 happiness habits, but that would be mostly trivialities. The happiest people are fundamentally paying attention to 4 things each day: their faith, their family, their friendships, and the work that serves other people. Those are the big 4, right? And you can't over-index on work, by the way. Well, that's like basically taking your entire pension and putting it in Greek bonds. It might work out, but I was trained as an economist, so don't do that. You need to have a diversified. I'm looking at Constantine, who's Greek, so I'm saying this for his benefit. It's you need a diversified and balanced investment portfolio. And the same thing is true for all of you and me too, which is you need to be thinking about your faith and your family and your friendships, which is to say love in different manifestations. Really critically important, and you can't leave it up to chance because it won't happen by chance. Faith is the first one, and it's often misunderstood. Now, I'm a Catholic, and it's literally the most important thing in my life. I go to Mass every day. Now, part of the reason I do that is because I'm a social scientist, and I have the data on me, and I want to be happy. I'm a selfish man, is the truth of the matter. Now, I, as a social scientist, will tell you that my Catholic faith is not the only path. The Christian faith is not the only path. I won't tell you who's metaphysically correct. That's above the pay grade of this conversation. I have opinions on that, right? But I will tell you that any serious effort at transcendence will give you the happiness benefit. Now, what do I mean? Transcending your own individual psychodrama. My patients, my job, my money, my lunch, me. It's so boring. I mean, you think about how boring it would be. I mean, you watch a medical drama on television. Okay, interesting. Watch the same episode over and over and over and over and over and over again. You're going to be desperate. That's what it's like to be stuck in your own psychodrama. You need relief, you need perspective, and you need peace. And the only way to do that is to get little, is to get small. And the way to do that is to zoom out. You got to zoom out on your life. That's transcendence. And you have to practice it every day. That's the bottom line. That's what the data say, but that's what common sense and all of our practice suggests as well. So how do you do it? Maybe that's studying the Stoic philosophers. Maybe that's taking a walk before dawn in nature without your devices, all of them, every day, 4:45 in the morning. Maybe that's studying the fugues of Johann Sebastian Bach and standing in awe of the fifth evangelist. Maybe that's a meditation practice. Maybe that's practicing Vipassana, where you're seriously metacognitively trying to understand yourself. Maybe that's the faith of your youth, which it is in my case. You must do something. That's the connection between faith and happiness.
So let me ask you one more thing before I go to some of the audience questions. You talk about zooming out, having that broader perspective. Is this something that is easier with age? For me personally, I feel like I've only been able to do that with age and perspective and just having lived more? Or is this something that at any age we can take advantage of and actually change things? Anybody can zoom out at absolutely any age. It is easier as you get older, and that's one of the reasons that people tend to get more religious as they get older. It's weird, because nobody believes more in the tooth fairy when they're 60 than when they're 10, right? People are more religious when they're 60 than when they're 30, though. What's up with that? And the answer is that it scratches a particular itch. And we're starting to understand more and more of the neuroscience of actually how the brain is being affected by transcendent experiences as opposed to superstitious experiences. The differences are quite profound between these two things. The people who mix these things up usually do so willfully, and it's not helpful, is what we think. But at the same time, we find that as people get older, it's easier for them to make jibe things that seem very conflictive at deep odds. When people are 20 or 25, this is generally speaking when they tend to be starting to wander away from their faith. One of the biggest reasons when you ask people in public opinion surveys about this is they say, how could there be a good and loving God when there's so much suffering in the world? Maybe some of you in medical school felt this very thing. Maybe some of you left the faith of your youth when you were in medical school because you saw so much suffering and it was incompatible with what you'd learned about an all-knowing and unloving God. Well, there's a funny thing that happens in your 40s, which is that you start to realize that life is pretty darn messy and a lot of stuff just doesn't add up. There's this that suffering is best dealt with in the Jewish and Christian religions in the book of Job. And the book of Job, of course, Job is torment. He's a just man, and God and Satan are in a wager, and Satan says, I can get that guy to stop worshiping. And God says, oh, let's see. Let's test him. And so he does every bad thing to Job. He's got boils on his skin, and all his kids get killed, and they run off with his cattle, and it's just the worst thing ever. And Job keeps worshiping. Job keeps loving the Lord. And he says, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. But at the end of Job, this is where it gets really interesting for all of us, right? In the 39th chapter of Job, Job puts God in the dock where he has a conversation with God. And he says, I blessed you all my life. I loved you all my life. And you did this to me. And God said, well, you're so smart, I guess I made a mistake. Obviously you were there when I made the heavens and the seas.
Obviously you were there when I made the stars in the sky. You're so smart, you tell me if I made an error. And the whole point is, we don't know what's going on. And you're more comfortable with that when you get a little bit older. You get a broader perspective on this when you get a little bit older. But here's the thing that I tell my adult kids, because my kids are in their 20s. This is going to be easier for you to understand because you will accept more things that you don't understand. So get a head start now. Get a head start on humility now. Get a head start on saying, I will be purified. I will submit to the will. Get a head start on that now, and you'll never be sorry you did that.
Should we take a look at some questions?
I would love that, yeah.
All right.
Yeah. I didn't think I was going to talk about Job and talk about happiness, but there you go. Job's on my mind these days.
All right. What if your own pursuit of happiness impinges on the happiness of others? For example, balancing the prioritization of your family while also striving to be the best surgeon.
Yeah. I see this an awful lot, and I see this particularly from strivers. I'm sort of I specialize in strivers. That's you know, and me, you know. I mean, I'm super into my work, and and one of the things that I've found is that people who think that they have to balance between their work and their love generally are fooling themselves. Here's what it comes down to. I know a lot of people who believe that they have to come to some sort of a balance between, you know, their love relationships and their use of alcohol. I see this all the time. Why? Because alcohol misuse is a relationship. The problem that I see with real strivers a lot of the time is that their work is actually their deepest love relationship. And that's a problem. That's an actual dysfunction. It's a malformation of our hearts. Your work is not going to keep you warm at night. Your work is not going to be at your bedside as you take your last dying breath. It's just not the case. And if you're basically making a whole lot of trade-offs between being so special and being happy, you're doing it wrong, is the bottom line. Now, I sound like I'm, you know, scolding you or something. I'm talking to me. I'm talking to myself. I've made this mistake again and again and again. I was a CEO for a long time. Before I was teaching here at Harvard, I was the president of a big think tank in Washington, D.C., called the American Enterprise Institute. It was this wonderful place, and I was the CEO for 11 years. It was an interim between my academic appointments. And I was so desperate to succeed. And the more I worked, the better I got, and the more I succeeded. It was the more hours I put in, the more money. I was raising $50 million a year, and I felt like the king of the mambo, because the more I did, the better I got. But I can't tell you the number of nights I spent that 14th hour at the office instead of the first hour with my children. I missed it. Me, I'm a happiness specialist. Physician, heal thyself. I'm no physician, obviously. The point is that they got revenge on me. They grew up. And I don't get it back. We don't have to make these decisions, because your specialness decision, which was wired into you by your parents who were exigent, by a culture that said you're so smart, that by the admissions committee at the Harvard Medical School, where they said, you got in here, you have an obligation to do nothing more than this, to become an automatonic medical scientific machine. You can't live an ordinary life like other people. You're not serving yourself, and you're not serving other people, and you're not doing it right if you actually believe that. It's pure propaganda, and it doesn't have to be that way. And if I could take it back in my own life, I would.
Let me ask you something specific to medicine, though, which is that we have this very, very intense training period, and then maybe it gets better after that. Yeah. So how about the idea that there's the delayed aspect of saying, look, I'm making a work-life trade-off now to get to where I want to be, which is going to allow me to have a different work-life balance in the future.
Right, yeah, and it generally speaking doesn't work. And there's a reason that it doesn't work. It's not that people who don't want to have a completely unbalanced life choose to do so temporarily. There's a lot of people who kind of are looking for that unbalanced life because they want to be special. Nobody likes, what are you doing? 75,000 hour rotations. I don't know what's actually going on in these inhuman residencies. But I know it's bad because I see doctors and it looks like they've seen a ghost, or the dark circles under their eyes and the whole thing. I sure don't want them to operate on me under those circumstances. The problem with that is that people self-select into these in dysfunctional and unhealthy environments. Now, I know that we need better protocols. We need actually better rules and better regulation of this so that we don't require people to do this. But we also need more education on how people can live good and balanced lives, so we're not asking people who are workaholics to self-select into our environment. You know, what happens is that I see this again and again and again. Doctors come out of their residencies and they keep kind of doing this for the rest of their lives. And that's kind of how they're wired. And that's what they did in college, and that's what they did in medical school, and that's what they did in their residency, and that's what they're going to do, and they're selling a bill of goods to their spouse. It's like, oh, honey, yeah, I know. You know, it's like, it's just temporary. And their spouse is like, okay, I'll see you in a couple of years, you know? Yeah. And then a couple of years go by, and a couple of years go by, and a couple of years go by, and actually it's not the exogenous exigencies, the scheduling that actually comes from the outside that's the problem. It's our hearts that are the problem. It's our dysfunctional relationship that we have with our egos and with our work that are the problem.
So this is a question to both of us. You've both had distinguished academic success. Do you think your happiness would be different if you worked in the same fields but did not have that success? So I'll take a stab at for me. I feel pretty confident that my happiness is not really related to the field that I chose or any kind of external trappings of success, because I feel like there's something inherent to just how I am that makes me either happy or not happy. And you know, so I used to direct the course on neurology for medical students, and you know, it's funny in medical school because you see archetypes of individual faculty, and then you just, you know, oh, he's the neurologist, she's the endocrinologist. And at the end of the course, sometimes I would say, you know, when I was in your shoes, I could have gone into neurology. I almost went into nephrology. You know, I thought about doing this. And they said, really? And I said, well, I didn't even know I was going into medicine. I thought about going into music. I thought about going into journalism. And they're like, but you're a neurologist. You're not any of those other things. But inside, I know that I could have been equally happy. I think I'm a happy person, and I think I could have been happy in any of those fields. And I think I was happy 15 years ago when I was struggling to get an R01 grant from the NIH and was in the thick of, you know, very busy clinical care. And I think I'm happy now. And I don't know, maybe I'm presuming too much, but I don't think that for me personally, my happiness is really related to what my job is, or whether I appear to have been successful at it or not.
You're a happy person.
I think I am.
I think you are. And that's really wonderful, because I bet you would funge that happiness into being an auto mechanic if you were so called to do. And that's a wonderful thing. Other people not so lucky. Other people it's a little bit more brittle. I'm much happier because of what I do than what I did in the past. Much happier. Look, I started off with a dream career. At 19, I dropped out of college, dropped out, splitting hairs. And I went on the road as a classical musician. I was a French horn player. I played a lot of my 20s in the Barcelona Orchestra. I toured for 2 years with a jazz guitar player named Charlie Bird. I made records with Charlie Bird. I mean, it was a dream life, and I was super unhappy, because I was kind of doing it for the wrong reasons. So I left and I went to college by correspondence, and then I did my graduate degree and did my PhD and became a social scientist. And I had a fun time as a college professor at Syracuse. I really liked it. And then I left because of ambition, and I was unhappy again as a CEO for 11 years. I didn't sleep well for 11 years. And then I left, and when I left, I thought about it. I thought, okay, I've got a little bit of experience in doing things wrong because I don't have Bernard's natural proclivities in joy. I don't have it. The reason I teach happiness is because I want it, by the way, right? Because it doesn't come easy to me. And so I thought about this very seriously. I went through a process that Christian people call discernment. I spent 6 months every day on my knees. And I said, Lord, what do you want me to do? and guide my path, which, you know, Christian people often ask, but they rarely actually mean. You know, but I really meant it. And I decided that what I was going to do was to dedicate the rest of my life to lifting people up and bringing them together in the spirit of love and happiness, using science and ideas. I really felt that God put that on my heart. And if you're not a Christian, you might say, well, something put it on my heart. But I wanted to do it, and I went very purposively into that, and the phone rang, and it happened to be, you know, this university, and this is, why don't you come and do that? And it was an opportunity to do it. So it has nothing to do with the fanciness of Harvard. On the contrary, if anything, you all join me in saying that that can be a real detriment because it's so much pressure all the time. There's so much attention all the time. It's not, being fancy is not great, right? But doing this, lifting people up and bringing them together in the spirit of love and happiness, using the science that I've learned and I'm blessed to be able to express to other people, I'm so much happier than I've ever been. I enjoy it so much more. I'm such a better husband than I was before. I was a pain to live with. I was the worst. I was grumpy all the time. I was never hungry. I had chronic insomnia. It was really a drag, quite frankly. And now my wife is like, this is great. This happiness thing is great. I'm finally happy living with you. So for me, it's made a big difference.
You talked about, though, how we see things, and this is how the brain works, in terms of contrasts, right?
Yeah.
That the most positive emotions are most positive because we contrast them with the negative emotions.
Right.
Could you have achieved this level of happiness earlier on, or did you have to go through that to get to how happy you are now?
Yeah. So Carl Jung talked about this an awful lot. I mean, and he talked about that happiness is truly an essence of, it's contrast, and context is everything. And so you need darkness to understand the concept of light. Modern social psychology suggests that that's not the case. Suggests that you actually can appreciate plenty of happiness without making a bunch of boneheaded errors like me. You don't have to actually have a bad marriage before you can have a good one and appreciate the good one. You don't actually have to follow malignantly narcissistic leaders down the rabbit hole of terrible politics before you can realize that you can be a happier person and a happier citizen. You don't have to do everything wrong. You can understand that you're a happier person. My guess is that you didn't make the mistakes that I did, and you know that you're a happy person. Is that fair?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I feel like I've made plenty of mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's a good question that we have. But we also find, by the way, that more and more and more that positive emotions and negative emotions are not opposite from each other. In many ways, they're processed in such different parts of the brain that you can look at the. Richard Davidson out at University of Wisconsin in Madison, he does a lot of work on the hemispheres of the brain that are more activated during happy and unhappy sensations, and he looks at the musculature of the face. Interesting thing that he does is he finds that people tend to, their face twitches a little bit when they're having unhappy emotions. Because the right side of the brain is actually more active when you're unhappy, is the whole idea. And so the idea that they're separable is actually quite important, because it means that one doesn't have to be off when the other is on, and you can have a full and rich existence. And this leads to one more, I think, important observation about all of this, which is that happiness doesn't mean the absence of suffering. This is a critically important point that I think that we all need to understand, that sure, you need to know what it feels like to feel crummy, to feel good, probably, but you also, to feel good, need to feel crummy. You actually need to learn and grow. You need to suffer. Suffering is unbelievably sacred. That for you to have satisfaction, you need to struggle. For you to have meaning, you need to have pain. If I asked any one of you to tell me when you found the resiliency of your life, you wouldn't have told me about that week at the beach in Ibiza. You would have told me about your darkest days in medical school, when you thought you might flunk out, when somebody you love left you at the altar, when somebody you cared for died and left you alone. That's what you tell me about, and that's a critically important thing. So when we talk about happiness and unhappiness, yeah, you probably need some suffering to understand the essence of your happiness, but you actually need to incorporate and live the essence of your suffering to be a truly happy person, which is a fully alive person in the first place.
So there's somebody who'd like to know how you mentioned wanting less. How does the principle of wanting less as a key to happiness pertain to burnout in medicine? So, people define burnout in different ways: emotional exhaustion, a sense of depersonalization, disconnection from the meaning of one's work. Are we just expecting too much? We should just want less, and then our expectations will be satisfied.
Yeah. It's not that simple, of course. I mean, obviously that's, and not to mention the fact that you can't just impose that. You can't just say, okay, today, interesting insight, I'm gonna want less. If only it were that simple. I mean, ambitious people are ambitious, and they're gonna keep working hard. They're gonna keep doing a lot. They're gonna keep, strivers, as they say, gotta strive. That's really important. But the whole point is that if you can offer up your worldly ambitions in a way where you're less attached to them. This is, I think, the important insight. Attachment is an important concept in almost every major religious tradition. I do a lot of work with my lab at the Kennedy School, the Leadership and Happiness Lab with the Dalai Lama. We do a lot of work every year. We go to Dharamsala and we do work with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And he talks about attachment all the time because this is part of, the first noble truth of Buddhism is that life is dukkha in Sanskrit, which basically means dissatisfaction. It's often translated as suffering, but it's dissatisfaction. And the essence of dissatisfaction is lots and lots of attachment to things. And the solution is to find detachment, and the way to do that is the course of life, is actually the essence of the life that we're trying to lead as people of different religions and people of different philosophies. It's actually trying to get away from that. But that's the critically important thing to recognize. I have a lot of attachments, and my goal is to try to be less attached. So, and here's by the way, here's how I do it to be really practical about it. When I was a younger man, I had a bucket list of my ambitions. And a bucket list is a terrible metaphor of all of your cravings and desires and in a bucket. And you take them out and you write them down on your birthday, and you imagine yourself enjoying the satisfaction of all these ambitions, and it fires you up. It's going to make you a better professional, right? But now I have a reverse bucket list. I'm going to turn 60 in 2 months, right? It's daunting, man. And so on my reverse bucket list, which I do on my 59th birthday and every other birthday these days, I'm going to take all of my ambitions out, I'm going to write them down, my worldly ambitions, and I'm going to cross them out. Not because I'm not going to get them, but because I want not to be controlled and managed by these ambitions. I want to manage my ambitions. I don't want to be controlled by these ambitions. I think that's the essence of what we actually need to do, to manage your feelings so they're not managing you. I don't want my ambitions knocking around my limbic system. I want them to be somewhere in my prefrontal cortex where I have a shot at the C-suite actually making the decisions. And if I can't do that, I'm in trouble, and I'm going to continue to be managed by it. But if I do that, I'm telling you, it's amazing. By the way, on my 59th birthday, you know what was on my reverse bucket list? My political opinions. Why? I need fewer political opinions, because I need more friends. And I found that my political opinions were too strong, and they were holding me back. They were holding me back from love for other people. And that was a big problem for me. I was reading Thich Nhat Hanh. I had written Thich Nhat Hanh's obituary in the Washington Post, and so I was reading a lot of Thich Nhat Hanh. And Thich Nhat Hanh said that the greatest attachment that people in modern life have is to their opinions. It's an interesting insight, isn't it? How many of us actually like, yeah, you can take my money, but don't try to get between me and my politics. I'll kill you if you do that. I'll cancel you if you do that, right? I wasn't really that radical about it, but I was finding that I wasn't friends with people that were really interesting and good and lovely, because I thought that they were wrong about stuff, and I didn't want to be held back by that. So I'm trying not to be earthbound in my understanding of what these attachments actually are. And that's what actually helps me to manage my wants as much as anything else.
Who is it that said that when given the choice between changing one's mind and proving that that's not necessary, most people get to work on the proof right away?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Last question from the audience. You got a laugh earlier when you talked about the corporate behavior of the big hospital networks. Yeah. And somebody would like to know, how can health systems be reformed to mitigate burnout and provide support to healthcare providers? How should those big hospital networks be acting?
Yeah, I'm outside of Harvard, I'm completely dedicated to answering this question, not for health networks, but for businesses. Why? Because people are suffering all over, not just doctors. People who are working in corporate environments all over the place are suffering in a big way. So I'm dedicating myself to going to a lot of companies and talking to them about the science of happiness. Science is the most amazing thing, right? I mean, progress starts with knowledge, and then changing habits, and then teaching it to other people. And one of the things that I found working with companies, large and small, mostly large at this point, is when they incorporate some of this knowledge about the science of happiness, about the science of well-being as we're understanding it, behavior really changes a lot. And people will just slap their foreheads. They'll say, oh, that makes sense. What I would recommend is actually more sophistication in the things that we're talking about for the people that are running these systems. They're not evil. I mean, I know you think they're evil. I know they're evil. But They're not. They're just people like us, and they're trying to work incentives, and they have a lot of pressure on them too. And what we all need is to understand ourselves as human beings, as frail and fallen and fixable in a lot of ways as well. And that actually is going to start with particular knowledge. I'm dedicating myself to doing that. I think we all need more of it. By the way, I believe we also need a class in the science of well-being in every medical school. I think this is critically important because it's astonishing to me that a lot of things that I'm talking about here are big news to doctors. You know, I thought doctors knew everything. And of course, nobody knows everything, but the more that this becomes common knowledge, in my view, for me, this is mission work. And for the rest of my days, I'm gonna try to spread this as far and wide as I can.
I feel like one of the things that doctors and scientists struggle with in the face of kind of large corporate behavior is the loss of agency. Yeah. And I feel like it's not just the hours and it's not just the nature of the work, but it's also that individual providers, researchers feel like they've lost control over the work and that they don't get to dictate, what they're doing, why they're doing, how they're doing it. They're not really given that choice. Yeah. And maybe that more than anything leads people to be very
For sure. I mean, this is one of the things about jobs, that when people don't feel like they have agency, they become deeply unhappy. They just do. And we think about that as sort of being a cog in a machine that we're not. You think about that as sort of low-skilled work or factory work. No. Lawyers feel the same way, doctors feel the same way, professors feel the same way. I mean, it's an amazing thing. When there's more rules that are coming down from the dean, professors become incredibly unhappy. Now, still, professors have more freedom than almost any other profession. I mean, there's no chance that the Harvard administration has any idea what's going on in my happiness class, right? I could be starting a cult and they wouldn't know, right? Maybe I am. Want to join? There's a brochure under all of your seats. But that's important, that agency is really key, and it's more so because you're running your own. Every doctor is running her or his own little business, and you're dealing with patients, and you're being told to do so by somebody who's not seeing the patient. It's incredibly disempowering and unbelievably frustrating. And the more that we can actually militate against that and fix that, the better off we'd all be. I say this as a patient, not just giving advice to administrations and doctors.
Professor Brooks, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.